Welcome everyone to Inside Academia, the weekly program where we take a look behind the ivory curtain. I'm your host, Andy Nash, and my guest today is Dr. Peter Wood. He's president of the National Association of Scholars, as well as former professor of anthropology and a college provost. Dr. Wood, welcome to Inside Academia.
Delighted to be here, Andy.
Thanks for joining us today. Tell us a little bit about the National Association of Scholars that you founded back in 1987. And what it's been doing and what its mission and purpose is.
Well, the organization came to life in the mid-1980s as a group of academics who were concerned about what we had just learned to call political correctness. They saw that the university was in danger of being politicized, multiculturalism, the beginnings of the diversity movement, a lot of attempts by the academic left to sort of muscle politics into the curriculum and to cut academic standards had alarmed traditional scholars. The traditional scholars were pretty much from all over the political map, liberals, conservatives, libertarians, but they saw a common cause in trying to protect the university from radicalism. And that's where the National Association of Scholars came together, had a rather explosive beginning. In its first few years, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, mainstream press was paying a lot of attention. Over the years, we won a lot of sort of tactical victories, but we basically lost the war. The university continued to be radically politicized. Things which had shocked people in the 1980s became pretty much standard fare in the 1990s and in the most recent decade. So we've had to do a lot of rethinking of what it is that we might reasonably expect to be able to achieve and what the long-term vision for American higher education ought to be. So where we are today is that we've broadened the discussion. We're still worried about actual academic programs, curricular decisions, matters of who gets into college and why, but we're also concerned about the structure of higher education, its finance, the fact that what many people are now calling the bubble, the idea that higher education has just enrolled way too many people and plunged them into way too much debt for the system to continue as it is.
According to your own website at nas.org, it says that you cite Alan Bloom's famous book, 1987 book, The Closing of the American Mind, which brought attention to the ravages, as it says here on the website, wrought by liberal ideologies on campus. And so, therefore, the founders of your organization summoned faculty members from across the political spectrum to help defend the core values of liberal education. What sort of specific things has your organization been working on in the past 20 years that address these issues, that actually physically, besides writing and publishing articles and books and countless other sources, what have you guys been specifically working on? Are you more of an activist organization or an advocacy group, or what exactly do you do?
I'd say we're mainly an advocacy group. We're nonpartisan, but we have a very definite view of what we think higher education should do and what it should look like. Maybe the single biggest achievement over our 24-year history was the passage in California in 1996 of Proposition 201, which basically was a referendum on affirmative action in public accommodations, meaning racial preferences in college admissions were outlawed by the voters in that state. The proposition withstood many legal challenges and stands today, although universities continue to look for ways to evade it and undercut it. That proposition, in turn, became a model for other states. Washington State, recently Michigan, recently Arizona passed similar sorts of things. And so we helped to define what the public response to racial preferences in college admissions should be. And poll after poll shows that large majority of Americans agree with our position, although we know that our position is wildly unpopular in higher education, which is quite addicted to using race and group preferences as an avenue to college admissions.
I'd like to bring your attention to a recent story that appeared in the New York Times here the other day. It revealed a story where a social psychologist, Dr. Haidt, University of Virginia, he was at a conference in San Antonio, Society for Personality and Social Psychology conference. And in it, it revealed that 80% of 1,000 psychologists in the ballroom there at this conference were self-identified liberals. And he goes on talking about the preponderance of left-leaning social and political viewpoints, and he referred to it as a tribal moral community, one that will embrace science whenever it supports their sacred values, but selectively ditches it whenever a scientific fact or a strain of reasoning would run against the grain of their sacred values. Firstly, do you even agree with that assessment? And then what does the National Association of Scholars do to address things like this? Because presumably, this is the sort of thing that's been going on for decades now, and for why your organization was even founded in the first place.
Yes, well, I did read Dr. Haidt's article. I'm not otherwise familiar with his work, but the first thing I would say to Dr. Haidt is welcome to the party. The New York Times reports that Haidt himself was, and I guess still considers himself to be a political liberal, but he's moved towards the center, and he's clearly distressed with what he's found. In that ballroom of about 1,000 social psychologists, only 3 people would self-identify as conservatives. This is just hugely out of sync with the American reality, where somewhere in the neighborhood of 40% of Americans consider themselves to be conservatives. To get a group of 1,000 people together and find only 3 conservatives is outrageous. It does indicate that there is a deep systematic problem of deselection within that academic discipline that precludes people who are traditional, conservative, libertarian, a whole range of political views that are out of sync with the progressive left are systematically excluded from that occupation. Well, I say welcome to the party because over the last 20 years, there have been a long parade of studies, some of them quite recent, that show the same thing in discipline after discipline. Now, we should be clear about this. Not all of higher education is subject to this screening out of people who defy the liberal left or progressive line. So you won't find it very much in schools of engineering or schools of business. But in the core part of the university, the old liberal arts, the social sciences and the humanities, the disproportion is just amazing. The best numbers you can, if you stretch the definitions of social conservatives, you can get something like a 9-to-1 ratio of liberals versus conservatives. If you look more closely at those figures, the disproportions are even greater. In fields like mine, anthropology, and fields like sociology, it's not uncommon to have departments in which there are no conservatives. Whole universities in which the humanities and social sciences might have a token or two conservative out of hundreds of faculty members.
Let me ask you, Dr. Wood, what argument can you make that ties that phenomenon to the mission statement of your organization? You want to stand for intellectual integrity in the curriculum and in the classroom and across the campus. That can cut against, in any direction. That could cut against left or right. Is it the fact that it's just predominantly one-sided? Is it the fact that it's left as opposed to right? Presumably you could have if it were right-wing or conservative for 80%, couldn't you make the same argument that the same phenomenon, the same groupthink sort of mentality would still be prevalent and applicable?
And we would indeed make that argument. Our beef here is with the politicization of higher education. If you take the root enterprise of higher education as pursuit of truth, it should not be politicized. There's a time and place for political questions. It's not in the undergraduate curriculum. Our view is that politics should end at the classroom door, and that a good professor should leave his students completely in the dark as to what his personal political convictions are. So we're not an advocacy group in favor of conservatives or Republicans gaining equal numbers in the classroom. What we are against is this use of the university to advance a political agenda. Any political agenda is a wrong political agenda when it comes to the basic core principles of higher education. Okay.
Part of why there's been a breakdown in higher education has been sending too many people to the college. How does, the overinflating the numbers, the ranks of students, how does that fit into with everything that we're discussing now in the context of the recent study that came out by Dr. Richard Oram? They just came out with that new book, Academically Adrift. He's a sociology professor at NYU, finished a 4-year research study in which the conclusion is that the students that, by and large, that attend colleges and university do not develop the critical thinking skills that they once did by going to college, and that they learn very little to nothing, at least in the first 2 years of college. So can you juxtapose that to what we're discussing now, as far as either radicalism in the ivory tower, or politicization, or is it more just the fact that there's too many of the wrong people are going to college, period, and it has nothing to do with politics?
Okay, you're asking me, Professor, and I'd like to give an hour lecture on that, but let me see if I can get it down to just a few minutes. The rise of mass education, basically the idea that everybody or almost everybody should go to college, is a problem somewhat separate from the radicalization of higher education, but though it's somewhat separate, there really is a deep connection. Let me give you a 30-second history lesson. At the very end of World War II, in 1944, Congress passed the Servicemen's Readjustment Act. That's the GI Bill. It was the first time that the federal government got involved in a really big way with sending more and more people to college and paying their way. Colleges liked that idea, and through the 50s and into the 60s, they pushed for the expansion of not only the GI Bill, but a lot of other programs. They were consolidated in 1965 as a Higher Education Act, which created a kind of middle-class entitlement for students to go to college. That was Title IV student loans, government-subsidized student loans, and it's those two steps that created what we have now of mass higher education. If you go back a century ago, about 5% of Americans attended college. Nowadays, about 60% of Americans attend college to some degree. Most of them don't finish, but nonetheless, we're mainstreaming more and more people into college. It's not a great surprise that given the low quality of our public education system, large numbers of those students don't do very well in college. The report that you mentioned, Academically Adrift, is a kind of really brilliant demonstration of what happens. We have now over a third of college seniors who, under a study, a testing instrument called the Collegiate Learning Assessment, are shown to have in 4 years learned virtually nothing. Now, they may have picked up a random fact here and there, but on the things that count, the critical learning skills, the critical work such as being able to synthesize ideas and take diverse material and bring it together and make sense of it. On that kind of scale, they're basically where they were when they started out as college freshmen. So a third of the students in America, that means something on the order of 7 million students. We now have 21 million students enrolled in college. Think of 7 million of them there, assuming enormous debt to be there, spending 4 years outside the labor market in a systematic way, and coming out of it equipped to do nothing more than they could have done just as high school entrants. Now, that's the basic problem that Aram points to, Aram and his co-author Roxa. How does that relate to the radicalization of the university? A different story. In 1962, the Students for a Democratic Society, the New Left as we now know it, put out a report that's popularly known as the Port Huron Statement that said the American left's attempt to foment revolution in America has failed because the proletariat really has no interest. But what we need to do, says the Port Huron Statement, is drop working for the laboring man and women, but instead focus on colleges. Let's radicalize the colleges. Now, that seemed like a crazy idea in 1962, but by, say, 1972, it was becoming fairly mainstream. And American higher education took to itself the idea that it could be the instrument of societal transformation. Now, there's lots of ways to sugarcoat that, but it fit rather nicely with the idea that higher education should be for everybody. We get everybody to attend college, and we can use college to transform social ideals. If we can make people into proponents of the radicalization of society, then the agenda of the radical left and the agenda of sending everybody to college begin to merge. Now, it's perfectly true that numerous politicians, left, right, and center, have thought that it's just a great idea to send everybody to college. The notion is abroad that it builds economic prosperity for the nation. It's how we become competitive as a people in a global economic system, and it builds individual personal prosperity. And those two themes have been recycled so much that people are somewhat taken aback by the prospect that neither one of them may be true. For example, right now we're looking at Egypt, a society which happens to be the most educated one in the Middle East. It has a huge number of college graduates. Most of them are unemployed. Most of them are now rioting. The idea that education itself builds prosperity doesn't make sense if you look at it on a worldwide scale. Educating the right people for the right skills at the right time is a big contributor to prosperity. And simply throwing everybody into college just doesn't work, nor does it produce personal prosperity.
Right.
Your chances are better off of a lucrative career if you manage to graduate from Harvard or Yale. Your chances of a lucrative career aren't really better off if you're a dropout from State U. The whole process here of trying to make Americans think that a college education is a sure thing has begun to fall apart.
We're out of time. What I'd like to do again is in the future perhaps revisit this issue with you and go into how the academic institutions have changed necessarily as a result of mass education. Which then, of course, leads into all the things for why the National Association of Scholars was founded, addressing some of the problems plaguing higher education today. So I want to thank you again, Dr. Peter Wood, President of the National Association of Scholars. Thanks for joining us. This has been Inside Academia with Andy Nash. Check us out again at InsideAcademia.tv, and please join us next week, as every week, as we take you for a look behind the ivory curtain.